target specifically small business. They just did it too quickly and too haphazardly with too few rules and too little oversight.
Or on the street for the last 3 months. I've been on the sidewalk. I sleep on a bus stop on Fountain in Vermont.
Your situation, how long you've been out on the streets? I guess the beach here in Venice?
I've been out here in Venice almost a year.
I'm a Navy vet. I've been waiting on VA to give me housing for the last 6 months. And so I'm still waiting.
My partner and I have been homeless since April. We lost our 3-bedroom apartment. We had 2 cats at one point. Even though we lived at this apartment for he was there for 6 or 7 years, and I was there for the last 3 or 4 of them. We were late on one payment, and they, kicked us out because of that.
I am housing insecure at the moment, even though I work, I study urban development. So, issues with housing are very central, I think, to issues that affect not just people's lives, but also society in general. And I think that tackling the housing crisis is one of the most important priorities that we have in this moment.
So we believe that in America, healthcare is a human right. We believe that education is a human right. We believe that housing is a human right.
What do we want? Public housing! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Public housing! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Public housing!
Well, I think there is no greater crisis and no greater imperative that we have right now in Los Angeles than addressing the crisis of homelessness that is in our midst. And there's no question that there is homelessness everywhere in the United States. It's an international problem, but it's particularly acute here in LA. And the number of people that we have who are unsheltered, who have nowhere to lay their head down at night other than on a sidewalk or on a tent, is greater here in Los Angeles than anywhere else in the nation. And it's a disgrace. And we have to do, as a city, much more, and not just do more, but do it smarter, do it more thoughtfully, use the money that we have wisely so that we can help the most people. And this is about helping those who are experiencing homelessness. It's about helping those who may be close to experiencing homelessness, and also the community at large, because everybody is impacted by this crisis.
Because I talked to a developer that told me about it, and he even said it. It ain't about taking care of the homeless; it's about making money, and that's the way it is, And so you either, you gonna have to accept it and do what you can to get yourself up out of here, because the help that they give you is superficial, really, basically superficial.
I think one of the issues that aren't really as addressed as much in terms of the homelessness issue is, where do these homeless people come from? And there's the source of homelessness, why people are becoming unhoused, is part of what we're seeing in terms of the housing crisis, is just an overall greater economic burden on working people and families. The costs of living are starting to really outpace the growth in wages. As an academic, I've seen my own profession go from being relatively comfortable, stable, full-time work to 75% of our profession now are being taught by contingent adjunct professors that go from semester to semester at poverty wages. This on top of the mounting costs of healthcare, of childcare, of student loan debt, of household debt and credit card debt. It's just more and more of a burden for people to pay when their incomes are more and more precarious. 40% of Americans right now cannot afford a $400 emergency. They can't afford a car breaking down.
Homeless people get identified as they're all from somewhere else, they're all crazy, they're all drug addicts, they're all scary, they're all going to rip you off. And we fight back against that. Our mission at our core is to connect the issues of oppression and the impact of neoliberalism on local communities. And that means we come from having been homeless, most of us. I was homeless for a while. Many of the people in our organizations were. And what we stand for is to fight the oppression and fight the abuse of poor people and of homeless people. And that covers the families, it covers immigrant rights issues, it covers housing issues, it covers business improvement districts and how they're privatizing our neighborhoods. It covers those things because all of those things together create a system of oppression. And then the militarization of our police departments is how they plan to address the massive disparity between the rich and the poor. And the growing numbers of poor people, the shrinking numbers of rich people, and the cumulative wealth that they keep getting more and more and more of. And you're living in a capitalist system. All of the wealth goes to a small percentage of individuals. Everyone else can either kill each other for what's left, which unfortunately is what our history has encouraged us to do, or they can band together and fight to demand change.
I had a house at 4111 Hamel Street. The LA County and the Board of Supervisors sued me over helping homeless people. They listened to the complaints of the neighbors that didn't like having my black lady friend. That was exactly when it started. And I had a black lady friend and her two black families, and they didn't like it and they complained, and the next thing you know, 6 years later, I'm homeless myself. But I was helping Mexican homeless people too, which exist, and they were brought up in the neighborhood, but they thought it would bring the property value down. So now my house is demolished that I used to live in. The place where we were helping 18 people is gone. The LA County did nothing to rehouse any of them except for one family, but basically I became homeless, my husband became homeless, a family of 5 living back in their car again, the girl that used to live in the laundromat, back in the laundromat, the guy on the park bench, back on the park bench. They have done absolutely nothing.
And let's be honest, the crisis that we have of affordable housing in Los Angeles and its more extreme manifestation, which is the crisis that we have of homelessness, is not an accident. It's no surprise that we got here. It's totally to be expected, I hate to say. If you make it really expensive to build, if you make it very time-consuming, if you do not keep up with demand, then you're going to have an undersupply. And that's exactly what we have right now. And so what we have to do is create a lot more housing of all types. Affordable housing, workforce housing, all sorts of opportunities, and different housing models. Looking at row housing, looking at micro housing models, shared housing models, you name it. But we gotta get it done.
With respect to costs, there are many layers of regulation that make affordable housing cost really high. For one, we're subject to prevailing wage, and often commercial prevailing wage, and that drives the cost up to 20% or more above what market rate would be. So, we also have a lot of soft costs that have been added on that are not normal for other market rate projects. There are many, many requirements and regulations that make the cost very expensive.
How much you pay for the land on a per unit basis. It could go from $25,000 if you're building in the exurbia, or it could cost $200,000 of land cost per unit if you want to build in the affluent areas in the Los Angeles region. So there's a big range there. Construction costs also can be affected by what size unit you're building, whether you're building a single or whether you're building a 3-bedroom unit, and how much parking you are providing. Some cities require a lot more parking than other cities, and that goes into cost. One underground parking space costs $50,000.
One of the major cost implications that I see is the fact that we have to go through entitlements on every single project we do, no matter the size, which means that we have to ask for discretionary approvals for everything we do. So that could delay a project for 3 years. You would have to go through a myriad of public hearings and public meetings, and each one is a risk for the developer where the project might not get done. It might not be feasible. And we have to do that because our zoning code, which is the framework within which we build, is from the 1940s. So if we had a framework within which to build which actually made sense for the next 100 years into the future, and we could develop more what's called by right, then that would save a lot of money. That would get a lot of projects on board a lot quicker.
Some of the things that affect us is labor shortage. Between the immigration fiasco right now and young people not wanting to get their hands dirty and go into construction, we have a severe labor shortage in construction. So wages and labor supply are two major components. Because of the tariffs, construction materials are going through the roof, have been going through the roof for the last 2-3 years. That also affects costs.
We have many different rules in the city of Los Angeles that control how things get built and how much space you need in terms of setback, in terms of height, in terms of density, in terms of common areas, in terms of how things are landscaped, in terms of the materials that are used, in terms of the amount of parking that you have to provide, which is often very expensive to create parking within many buildings, especially if you go underground. So you add the cumulative impact of all these things and a variety of different fees that we have. Again, many that are well-intentioned and put to good use. But all of that cumulatively adds to the price tag of building more.
The way that we build housing is pretty much the same over the last 60, 70, 80 years. The only difference is that the building standards have gone up. So we have much better energy requirements, whether it's passive energy savings or we have much better earthquake seismic requirements. Those are all safety issues that you don't want to give up. To make housing costs, construction costs really goes down substantially requires a complete rethinking of how we do construction. So people now are experimenting on modular construction in different ways, although modular construction has been around for decades, and there is a reason why cities are so resistant to allowing modular construction in their jurisdictions.
What we always try to do is we're just happy if we can get affordable housing to get down to the cost of normal market rate housing, which it should be or less. But it's really the regulations and the requirements that kind of drive that up. To give you an example, everything should be accessible, and that's a good thing. But if you can imagine for a minute going into a parking garage and every single space is an ADA stall. Can you imagine that? That sounds absurd, doesn't it? Well, that's what we have to do in affordable housing. 100% of our housing product need to be fully ADA compliant. And so if you just simply took a common sense approach and said, let's make, projects not 100%, but 50% accessible, you would save tons of money. But that's a regulatory decision. It's not an architect's decision on how to do that. And when the money comes through, say, Prop HHH, those are just added on and added on. So we have many, many layers of requirements that, in our opinion, just don't make any sense. And all they do is drive the cost up.
I have been very vocal and, quite frankly, very disappointed about the progress that has not been made when it comes to Triple H. The promise was that there were going to be 10,000 units that were created of mostly permanent supportive housing and largely for those who are experiencing homelessness. Now, nobody expected that those units would be done in one day, but it's now almost 3 years. We have yet to see one of those units completed. Now, there will be some that are completed by the end of the year. There are a couple of hundred that are online soon, but it is a very slow process, taking 3+ years. It's a very expensive process, with these units often for efficiency units costing anywhere between $525,000 to up to $700,000. If that is what your cost is to create much needed housing, then you're not going to have enough money to create and to keep up with the demand. We have to find ways to do it in an effective way so that we can house as many people as possible and alleviate so much of what we have going on our streets.
I don't see any meaningful increase in cost reduction in the foreseeable future.
A couple weeks back, around 10 p.m., I had the tent up and the cops came and took it down, and they told me that tents were not allowed on the beach. And I stated to them, I said, for one, I said, cops, first cop told me from 9 p.m. to 6 p.m. that we could have a tent on the beach. And they told me, oh, curfew is at midnight. And then I was like, so for the time, they told me it was 10. And they said, we're going to have to write you a ticket. I go, why are you going to write me a ticket if it's not even midnight to write the ticket? And they're like, oh, you already know the routine and you know how this runs. And they wrote me the ticket around 10 p.m. And they told me that next time they see me with the tent, they were going to take me to jail. And I had to move all my stuff because my husband, he was in the hospital for an emergency, in the emergency room that day. Because that day the cops harassed him and he got pepper sprayed by the cops. So he had to go to the emergency room that day.
What you see very clearly documented just by looking at the HUD budget was massive cuts to affordable housing funding. The 79 Carter cut across the board. There was a recession, if people are old enough to remember back in those days. Reagan came in 1980 and just specifically went after HUD. That within 2 years, 3 years of those cuts happening, we had emergency shelter programs opening up across the country. And it was still at that time associated with, well, there's a recession. Look, there's long lines at the gas station, and there's long lines at the food bank, and there's long lines in these new shelter programs that have just opened up. Recessions have come and gone since then. The economy's gone up, the economy's gone down. What has not happened is the restoration of the affordable housing funding levels back to pre-1979 levels. That has never taken place. And so without that, homelessness has continued for 37 years in spite of the other factors that were supposedly creating the problem in the first place.
You have to look at American history and particularly American political economy over really the post-World War II period, but the significant change that occurs with the election of Ronald Reagan and the change away from a sort of, at the time it wasn't called this in the United States, but a social democratic social contract that came out of the New Deal in World War II, the Roosevelt administrations, got solidified in the Truman administrations, and it got built upon all the way through, in some ways, to the mid-1970s. And there was a social safety net. There was very, very strong middle class, a lot of access to home ownership for people, single-income households, etc. And there was generally, throughout this phase, of course, low unemployment, and the wealth disparities were relatively narrow in the society. Then Reagan came, and you start to have a different system gets put in place. And one of the very most conspicuous aspects of the Reagan Revolution in its early years, and I was in my late teens at this point, was the appearance of people living on the streets in the United States of America. And, especially if you're like 18, 19, you're growing up in the wake of the 60s and 70s and all the freedom that 18 and 19-year-olds had happened at that time, and the idea that you could just run around across American society and have fun and do whatever. And all of a sudden, these people, start showing up on the streets of America, and it just was, sort of right in your face as this terrible cautionary tale that this is no longer a society that's going to take care of all of our people or even have a pretense of it. We're going to just let people live these horrible lives, completely isolated, tragic, broken people out on the streets, and especially in population centers. And of course, it's never really gotten better since that point. It's gone in waves where it's been a greater or lesser crisis since that time in the early 80s. It never at any point was there an adequate social or political response to the homeless crisis in the United States of America. So it's been a constant. But certainly in the period after 2007, 2008, the market crash that occurred, and we're speaking in California, the absolute just explosion of homeless people in Southern California in particular, but across the West Coast and particularly in California, San Diego Metro, Sacramento Metro, Bay Area as well. It's something that, you know, going back to when I was a child, before the Reagan Revolution, I would never have believed that was possible in the United States of America.
Well, I wasn't working and was still married, and I was working for a while, and my wife walked out on me. Couldn't find a job and blah blah blah, and that's how I became homeless. But I wasn't homeless right away. I used to work somewhere where I lived and worked there. So I became homeless after that wasn't available anymore, and that's past 2 years. But overall together it's been 6-7 years. Time just flies by, man. I don't even know how it went by. In my case, it was the lonely part that played a big, the hardest, and I took it very hard because I came from a big family, and there was always people around, and all of a sudden there's nobody around, and here I am going and literally walking the streets.
I helped to draft legislation to put us on a housing first model, which basically says that we're going to move people into housing as quickly as possible, because now there's a system where we have folks who go into shelters and then transitional housing, and there's a protracted period of uncertainty there because they're never sure if they're going to be tracked for housing, when they're getting tracked for housing. And there have been several pilot studies that have been done which has shown that the longer that people stay homeless, the higher the cost is to taxpayers. In California, it's $25,000 to $35,000 per person. That's not housed, as opposed to putting them into permanent supportive housing or providing that for them. I haven't seen anything like concrete come out of it yet because it's still fairly new. Governor Newsom is still, fairly new in terms of getting into the job. But I do think, I applaud him for his commitment to homelessness, and we basically cannot move fast enough.
Measure H was a countywide measure, and that was for a variety of different services. The Triple H was a city bond measure, again for $1.2 billion. That was more for the bricks and mortar, as you would call it. I have been very vocal and, quite frankly, very disappointed about the progress that has not been made when it comes to Triple H. The promise was that there were going to be 10,000 units that were created of mostly permanent supportive housing, and largely for those who are experiencing homelessness. Now, nobody expected that those units would be done in one day, but it's now almost 3 years. We have yet to see one of those units completed. Now, there will be some that are completed by the end of the year. There are a couple of hundred that are online soon, but it is a very slow process, taking 3+ years. It's a very expensive process, with these units often for efficiency units costing anywhere between $525,000 to up to $700,000. If that is what your cost is to create much needed housing, then you're not going to have enough money to create and to keep up with the demand. We have to find ways to do it in an effective way so that we can house as many people as possible and alleviate so much of what we have going on our streets. We need to find all sorts of different funding sources, but most of the housing that is created happens in the private sector in this country. And how do we find a way to really incentivize that? How do we find a way to see that it gets built much more quickly and much more efficiently, and that when things get built, that there's not just a focus on luxury housing, but that there's a focus on housing for everybody else? And you do that, by the way, you do that with density incentives. You can do that with tax incentives. You can do that with all sorts of ways in which you choose to exercise the land use power of local government. There are a lot of ways to make that happen.
There's examples of what community can do when it comes together in a human rights and a social justice context, and incorporate the issue of homelessness into whatever it is they're creating. There's housing corporations like Venice Housing in LA that actually does community in their mission and in their heart. There's the beloved community, this tiny home village that Denver Homeless Out Loud pulled together, where the residents run the community. There's things like the Street Sheet, that 30 years they've been giving out street papers to homeless vendors or non-homeless vendors, community members, to sell on the street. That's raised millions of dollars that have gone directly into the pockets of poor people.
When you look at homelessness, you have to look at the unsheltered homeless and the sheltered homeless. Sheltered homeless are the people who are couch surfing, living off the graces of their friends and relatives. And the unsheltered homeless are the people you see on the streets. And even those have somewhat of a hierarchy, the people who are in tent encampments and the people who are living in RVs like the one next door. When you start talking about the unsheltered homeless population, there is a high incidence of mental health issues. And I think that universal health care is a way to make mental health services available, accessible, and unintimidating for the unsheltered homeless, and that is essential. As it is now, you have mental illness, you're on your own. Even though the county is making a valiant effort to reach out to that population, there's just not enough resources, in the county to help everyone who need 24/7 type of support. Universal health care, very important. Having labor take a larger slice of the pie relative to capital in terms of our gross domestic product, very important, because nobody who's working full-time should be living in their cars. Minimum guaranteed income, minimum wages, those are also important policies.
I think the first question that I really would love to have people who consider this question of homelessness in the United States of America is this something that our current economic political system, the way it's really structured in the real world, can tackle? Or is this impossible to do in the system that we live in? And I frame it that way so broadly because, who amongst us, especially if you're not, a really, really right-wing libertarian or some kind of extreme, American right-wing evangelical, who really will claim publicly that they don't want to tackle this, that they want to have the opportunity for everybody to have a bed who needs a bed and a domicile. And yet, there's nothing even remotely like an adequate response, or really anything within the framing of the current system that people honestly think this will be addressed and the problem will go away. So are the solutions that have been proposed, they're inadequate, they're not responding to it? Can something that doesn't fundamentally break with the logic of our economic and political system adequately address this? By adequately, I mean it's a human right. Everybody who needs a home, gets a place to sleep inside. They're no longer on the streets. And that's so it's mainly throwing out that question and encouraging people to demand that nothing short of that answer be achieved by our society.
I grew up in Australia, spent the first 24 years of my life there, travelled around a bit, worked in France for a while, came to the States in '81, ended up in academia and been teaching in a business school now for the last 30 years. It's a great perch from which to look close up at the workings of the capitalist system. I think the most basic challenge of housing and homelessness is under capitalist conditions. Land on which the housing is built is private property. And land's a special kind of resource, a special kind of private property, because unlike, say, the clothes we buy, it's not produced for the market. It's a part of nature that exists in intrinsically limited supply. And that means that there might be unused land that we could build on, but it's going to be farther and farther away from where people want to live and work. So why does that matter? Why does this limited nature of land matter? Well, what it means is that the people who own land set a price for it that doesn't reflect the cost of producing it. It reflects only the balance of power between the people who own the land and people who want to use the land. So it's a very different dynamic. And what that means in practice is that whenever land becomes an attractive investment opportunity for people, whenever they have money they want to invest in building and owning rather than renting, the price of land can very quickly escalate to the point where housing becomes unaffordable for a lot of people. So unlike shirt makers, there's no technological innovation that's going to enable them competitors to come in and offer housing at much lower costs and push the price of housing back down to an affordable level. And the net effect of that is to make housing a special point of vulnerability for working people. There are some decades-long periods where housing seems reasonably affordable and we don't have a homelessness problem. But then in the history of capitalism over the last 150 years, there's also been long stretches of decades at a time where working people simply can't afford decent housing. So you might imagine that that creates a bit of a problem for the powers that be, let's call it the capitalist class. You imagine that if a lot of people can't afford housing, it's going to make them push harder for higher wages, and that will raise the wages that capitalists have to pay in order to attract and retain workers in their businesses. That's true, but on the other hand, you have this whole other group within the capitalist class who's making money by investing in land as a financial asset. So there's these two factions of the capitalist class that are at war over the appropriate price of land and the appropriate affordability of housing. The result of that is pretty unpredictable. From the working class's point of view, that's a pretty scandalous situation where you can't trust that from one generation to the next people are going to be able to afford housing.
Why is it that corporations are taking larger and larger profits and wages have pretty much remained stagnant? So when you have wages stagnant, not keeping up with rent increases, you have an affordable housing crisis. That's where we are. Why aren't wages increasing at the same pace that rents are increasing?
The private sector is the one that creates most of the housing, as we know. But we have many, many rules that we have set up, often with some of the best of intentions. And you want to have a lot of controls. But it's also a system that has made it very expensive. And then what do we end up with? We end up with pretty much all luxury units being built. And then we have this undersupply of housing for everybody else. And you've got to shift that. And you've got to shift that paradigm so that it is possible for government to find ways to promote public housing, or housing also in which the public is helping with vouchers or other kinds of ways to assist, but also that it's being done in the private sector as well, and by nonprofits. We need all of it.
They can clean it up, and now they're going to have to add more money to it because it's going to run out again this week. It's not in and of itself a bad idea, because these are obviously businesses, we want to say, that don't have access to capital markets in other ways.
What are you hearing from the business community? What would they prefer at this point? They see, I mean, all of a sudden it was like this race to see who had the best relationship with your banker.
Last few decades, we've seen capitalists veer away from investment in what we call the productive part of the economy. Profit rates have been falling across all the Western advanced economies, and more capitalist investments being directed in the financial sector, into financial assets, including land. That's driven the price of land way up. More and more people wanting to invest in land with a limited supply of land that we can't create more land for them to buy. So the price of land, and therefore the price of housing, goes up correspondingly. You could imagine we could try to fight this with rent control, but I come back to the fundamental character of the economy as a capitalist economy to say that rent control historically has never been a very effective means of dealing with the housing affordability problem, or let alone the homelessness problem. And it's not that easy to see, it's not that difficult, I should say, to see why. Either the rent control is stringent and enables lots of people to afford housing, in which case it's just not very profitable for private sector developers to build more housing, and you do end up suffering a housing shortage. Or the rent control is light enough so that there's enough incentive for for-profit developers to build new housing, but in which case the working people who need rent control are not getting much benefit from those measures. So I don't quite see how we make much of a dent in our homelessness problem and our housing affordability problem until we somehow find our way past the capitalist nature of the housing market.
I am totally in support of rent control. Rent control is not a long-term solution, but given our affordability crisis, it has to be here today to prevent speculation by investors and to prevent people from getting kicked out of their house because they get, somebody buys their unit and decides to increase the rent by 20%.
The way that you stay within the American economic system and political system, you don't break in any fundamental way with the logic of our market-driven economy regulated by government policy, right? That addresses homelessness is to simply find the money for the state to build the houses and then have the people be housed. And yet that's not something that is even really being directly attempted on a level that would solve the problem, okay? So why is it that that's not on the table? And then, of course, if you conclude that there's no way to be done within the logic of the current economic system, what other social organizational principles would you pursue to be able to achieve that? As PDA, we pretty much operate on the first one and not the second one. But we do leave the second one open as a question because I think, just as just a broad historical question, so not advocating for revolution, but to say, okay, if we can't do this, it is a fundamental crime against humanity that we tolerate the continued existence of people sleeping out on the streets. In my opinion, it's so severe. If anybody doesn't think that, then please, go out and sleep on the streets for a week and see how you do.
We must end homelessness in the United States by doubling funding. We believe that when you get old, you are entitled to retire with dignity. We believe that a clean environment, when you turn on the water in your house, you have a human right to make sure that water is not toxic. We believe that there is something fundamentally wrong when so many of our people are homeless or spending far more than they can afford at the same time as we have more income and wealth inequality than any other major country on earth. That is wrong as well.
Here at Occupy Los Angeles, we are dealing with a lot of critical care and chronic health issues, as well as mental health issues. Because we're in Los Angeles and we have a significantly large homeless population here in Los Angeles, from a physical medical health issue as well as a mental health issue, we have a lot of people who are in great need. We have some of the bottom of the 99% that have been failed by the system outside. And so here we're trying to connect people with resources and services so that they can get the help that they need.
I think that we need to bring back public housing because the federal government is really the only entity that really has the kind of deep revenues to support housing affordability for all the people who need it.
As to how much is for public housing or for affordable housing, very, very little. And that's the problem.
My name is Rihanna. I am the co-chair of the Housing and Homelessness Committee for the Democratic Socialists of America. Yeah, really great to be out here with all of you today. We need more public housing yesterday. We have 60,000 people sleeping on the streets of Los Angeles. We have 3 people dying on the streets every day because of homelessness. And it is completely unacceptable that the city continues to criminalize people for sleeping on the streets when they offer no alternatives. In Echo Park, there's a community of unhoused residents peacefully living at the park. They have a great community, they keep the park clean, they're great community members. However, every week the city is coming in, doing aggressive sweeps, throwing away the personal property of residents there simply because they're trying to exist on public space. And that is absolutely unacceptable. We need to end the sweeps, we need to provide solutions instead of criminalization measures, and we need to build public housing on vacant city land.
And it's very important that the community, whether they're unhoused or housed, work in solidarity with the labor movement. We work together on this issue because literally the lives of unhoused people depend on this solidarity. Because without this unity, elected officials will continue to do nothing and hand over our public money. It's our public money. We pay taxes. Whether you have a shelter or permanent home or not, we all pay taxes. And elected officials, without labor and community pressure, they will continue to hand over our public money to for-profit private developers, which is furthering the crisis and literally killing and dehumanizing people.
I'm here because we definitely have a problem with our homeless, our houseless in the city of Los Angeles. We have hundreds of lots just like this owned by the city, and yet they're still empty. They spend millions and millions of dollars, and our lots are still empty for affordable, low-income housing for those that are marginalized and have very low income. We need housing now.
What do we want? Public housing. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Public housing. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Public housing. Now. Public housing. Now. What do we want? Public housing. When do we want it? Now.
I think somehow we've got to socialize the ownership of land. That way, you eliminate the profit incentive from the land ownership, and you can imagine a much more affordable housing. It's not just marginal to the private sector housing market, but it becomes the core of our housing amenities, so that public housing becomes the first choice, and private home ownership becomes a very second choice, and we marginalize the for-profit rental arena.
Public housing, I think more of the social housing, like what Venice is doing or what other communities have done in other parts of the world, where this isn't about, well, we need to put them over here, or we need to create a ghetto here, or we need to go back to the 60s and the massive redevelopment agency stuff. And then the existence is totally reliant on the benevolence of the federal government. We've already seen what that gets us. And so we need to get more into a mindset of decommodification of housing as a structure.
Once you socialize the ownership of land, essentially on that land, you can have the public sector build public housing. Public housing in the United States has accumulated a pretty bad reputation, but for the wrong reasons. Public housing can be a very effective way of ensuring housing affordability and creating housing stock that supports a vibrant life in the economy. We had a fairly deliberate effort over many decades in the United States to degrade the quality of the public housing that we had on offer. Real estate interests and other interests made sure that there was very little subsidies to the maintenance of public sector housing, so the housing stock dilapidated pretty quickly. They were often increasingly public housing was built on marginal locations that made them very undesirable as far as commuting is concerned. But other countries have had very successful public housing programs. The United Kingdom, for example, right after World War II, they had a very progressive Labour Party at the time in government, and they had a massive public housing program. Even in 1979, something like 40% of people in the UK lived in public housing. After Thatcher got on the scene and decided to privatise all this stuff, now they're down to something like 8% of people in the UK have access to public housing, and in many cases they've starved that housing stock of the kind of maintenance it needs. About a century ago, they had a very progressive social democratic party in power in Vienna at the city level, not at the country level. There was a massive homelessness problem and housing quality problem because a lot of people after World War I had agglomerated around Vienna, and so that led to a massive housing crisis. And just fortuitously, it turned out that some political changes within Austria gave Vienna, as a city, the status of an almost independent little state within the broader federal structure of Austria. So that the social democratic government of the city managed to install a very progressive taxation system and impose luxury taxes. A lot of powerful rich people didn't want to leave Vienna, and so sucked it up and paid these much more aggressive tax rates, and the city government used that revenue to create a massive program of public housing, inspired by a very progressive vision of the way our housing stock could reflect socialist values. So, for example, these housing units had communal kitchens, communal laundry facilities, communal nurseries and daycare facilities and libraries. There was a big effort to free women from the tyranny of housework, as they called it, by turning those jobs into paid jobs that some women and some men took, but freed up women from the drudgery of household work and taking care of the family in the nuclear family context. Rents were very low. As I understand it from the history that I've read about this, it's something like 5% of the average worker's wage, right, to live in magnificent housing. This was really beautiful housing, glorious architecture, not isolated. These were in prime positions in the middle of the city. The government used its authority to locate these housing systems in the middle of the city in attractive locations. Today in Vienna, still something like a third of the city lives in these same public housing units, and they're amongst the most desirable housing units within the city of Vienna. So I think that's a pretty inspiring example of a much more aggressive program that doesn't aim to tinker at the edges and force the private sector to contribute to social welfare and access to housing, but that asserts the power, our collective power through government, to ensure housing is withdrawn from the commodity sphere of for-profit housing and turned into a social good.
The difference between public housing and public-private partnerships is a bit of a gray area. Generally, public housing would be done by a nonprofit funded by, either tax credits or some public monies done specifically for a 100% affordable housing project, meaning that's the only thing that would go in there. We do those. They're good things, but I don't believe that those are really the answer. Public-private partnerships are a little bit more messy in that there's some piece of, even a developer who will develop affordable housing as part of an agreement to do let's say a market rate project. So that happens again all over the place. Still, what happens is they're segregated. They tend to be segregated, even though they're called partnerships. There's the market rate over here, and then there's the affordable over here. What it really should be is inclusionary housing, meaning that the affordable is part of market rate. And that's the way our cities used to be. They were never segregated by income, and they shouldn't be that way. There's no reason to separate people by their ability to pay rent.
One of the things that we don't do is look at our neighborhoods. So we look at buildings and say, is this 100% affordable or is it mixed income levels? We have yet to look at neighborhoods and say, here's a neighborhood, do you have your 20% affordable houses in your neighborhood? We don't do it that way. We do it building by building. And so the solution might be to look at neighborhoods this is a neighborhood. Every neighborhood should have at least 20% define affordable however you want, but you need to have that much affordable houses available for people in your neighborhood, and we could look at it that way, but right now we don't look at it that way.
Out here, we're doing some type of protest, and we try to raise funds for the homeless vet out here.
I'm here trying to help him support some cause to help the veterans so they can get jobs and housing that are homeless and everything like that.
The idea that millennials and the younger generation are drifting away from single-family homes to other forms of living, I think is fantastic. You know, I mean, that's the way it should be. You know, there's as much criticism as sometimes they get with being their face buried in social media. You know, a lot of them don't care about car ownership or home ownership. They value more the kind of social aspect of life, and I think that's a really great thing. So it's kind of interesting that you mention that, because we're now seeing for the first time in more than 5 decades there were more people moving to cities than suburbs.
I've always thought that suburbia is, a very problematic form of social organization. Its impact on culture, its manner to isolate people, to break apart the social fabric that human beings have always lived with, and it produces a lot of. There's the expectation, and there's been the realization in America of a lot of social and psychological problems in the society that I think have at least more than just a tangential relationship to suburbia and how it's the demographics and topography of suburbia. But people seem to love it, and given the choice, they'll go for it. And, I don't know how we overcome that.
But I also think the single-family house as a type belongs in the Smithsonian Institution, because the amount of energy, money, the amount of kind of environmental degradation that comes out of it is not sustainable. And our country is full of low-density suburban sprawl, and we just need to stop that, because it's not sustainable.
It needs to be more compact, I mean, smaller sites, more density. I mean, there's just so much benefit that comes with more compact living.
So what we see in the Scandinavian countries today, insofar as they're still governed by social democratic parties, which is less and less the case, the social democrats are being kicked out of the government of quite a few of these countries, Sweden, Denmark and others, but insofar as they're still social democracies, what you see there is a strange effort to capitalize on the dynamism of an economy that's still basically a capitalist economy, but counterbalance the problem, or overcome some of the problems associated with that capitalist economy through stronger regulation, through stronger welfare provisions. It doesn't work in the long run. These countries certainly provided a level of welfare and quality of life that was much better than we have in the United States. I totally understand why people would much rather see the United States move in the direction of some of these Nordic social democracies. But in the end, those countries, especially as they got incorporated into an increasingly globalized economy, came under enormous pressure from international financial markets to reduce their federal budgets, their national budgets. Because this version of social democracy implies some sort of compromise with the capitalist economic sector, there's not very little government can do that would hurt the profitability of that sector. Government can tax and it can regulate, but if it tried to do anything that seriously impaired the profitability of the capitalist private enterprise core of the economy, everything would grind to a halt. So, can we improve the lives of working people? Can we improve access to decent housing within the framework of capitalism? Yes, maybe, to some extent. Possibly for some period of time, but can we reliably assure people of the right to decent housing under capitalist conditions? I don't see how we get from here to there through the social democratic Nordic model. Housing is one of those arenas where we're going to need a push towards a more deeply socialist approach if we want to solve it.
Capitalism by itself is not, I believe, to be an enemy. It's kind of when we lose our empathy towards other people where it becomes a problem.
And to me, what Larry means by empathy is, why don't we have universal health care in this country? We should. Other countries do. We're the wealthiest country. We need to have universal health care. We have policies that are social policies that have benefited a certain segment of the population and not everyone. So when the National Highway Act, for instance, we build highways everywhere so people could own houses, single-family houses. Well, who owns a single-family house? Not the poorest of our society. So I know as a homeowner I get a mortgage deduction, but if I'm a renter, which I was for a while, I don't get a mortgage deduction because I'm a renter. So we have policies that benefit a certain segment of the population, and what we need to do is have policies that benefit everyone. And I see healthcare and housing as basic rights that everyone should have in this country.
Moving our system to something closer to countries like Norway and Sweden would represent an enormous step forward. But indeed, Norway is very proud of its program to encourage electric vehicles on their own road, but they export enough oil to become, I think if I'm not mistaken, they're the 7th biggest exporter of oil and gas in the world. So if you add their environmental footprint domestically to the environmental footprint of their exports, you discover that they're a major polluter. And in Sweden seems like a rather pleasant place insofar as they've maintained the social democratic policies. But when you factor in the massive arms exports, you realize that they're earning the quality of life that they're offering their own citizens at the cost of the quality of life to people around the world. I've argued that we need to socialize the ownership of the productive resources that ensure the production of the goods and services that we rely on. In a modern economy, we don't produce what we wear, we don't produce for ourselves what we wear or what we eat, our own habitat. We rely on other people to produce these things for us using tools and technologies that are the fruit of the creativity of millions of people over millennia. Ownership of those resources is quite out of sync with the reality of our productive activity. The ownership is privatized, but the nature of the productive activity has this interdependence, social quality. And so, as I see it, there are so many problems in our lives today, in our society today, that reflect that mismatch between the system of property and the system of production. Homelessness and housing affordability is one example amongst many. But no, you get to own your own toothbrush under socialism. It's just that you don't get to own the sort of productive resources on which everybody else depends and to which everybody else has contributed so many and so long.
We are our own worst enemies. We don't want to have housing being built around us because there will be more traffic and not enough parking. And that housing is going to block my view, block my sunlight. And we're the people who created this problem of not having enough housing and having this affordability crisis. So I think that the solution is really within all of us. Our responsibility is to make the elected officials respond to us rather than respond to homeowners groups who are constantly standing in the way of building more housing, any type of housing, affordable housing or market rate housing.
I do think there's a consistency with what the social economic priorities are in the society in the post-Reagan years, quite in contrast to the way that the Roosevelt people address these issues with the regulations after World War II, continued in the year after World War II. And so we get up to the period we are now, we're 12 years past the market crash. We're supposedly well out of the Great Recession, but home ownership rates are nothing like they were in 05 or 06. I don't think anybody claims they're going to get back to that. And we have loads of homeless people. So where's the place where we generate the revenue, we generate the space for housing all the homeless people? I mean, you build low-cost housing, you create federal job guarantee, still doesn't take care of everybody, right? Maybe we'll take care of half to 2/3 of the homeless population. But does the society also have the capacity to just build domiciles and have people be housed in them? And I would like to think that American society can be, if the argument can be made and put in front of the public, I do think there's a strong chance that the American people would support housing as a human right, the full elimination of homelessness in the society, and the resources could be allocated. But again, that's not the way the system works. Because how do you get that argument even in front of people in the United States of America?
We, as a nation, need to understand one thing, that we need to come together as a people, because the politicians are definitely not working in our favor. I don't care if it was Obama or Bush. It doesn't make a politician's a politician. And it's all about the politics and what they can do for their own party, what they can do for themselves.
Why not just say housing is one of those things that, it's a good thing. It has a public benefit for all. And let's make sure it's available to all. And it's not charity. It's access to housing for all people. Same with healthcare and the same with education. The more members of a community, no matter who they are, that are healthy, really healthy, and well educated, and have a decent place to live within that community, the healthier and stronger that community is going to be. So take certain things that are a true benefit to everybody and make sure that those items are available to everybody, and see how much stronger and how much more vibrant your community can become.
So I think within American culture, even subject as we've been for a couple of centuries to these corrosive effects of capitalism, I think people nevertheless preserve a genuine sort of commitment to their fellow human being, and we can nurture that, and we can. And it doesn't take much imagination to imagine a form of society in which that collaboration and competition is the primary feature of our shared culture, rather than competition being the primary theme.
Its prediction of coronavirus deaths here in the
Does PDA have a political analysis of the crisis around the coronavirus? And I think, first and foremost is the failure of the Trump administration, the defunding of the various government agencies that need to be frontline in terms of addressing these matters. The necessity of adequately having the funding of the science-based organizations and agencies that are a significant part of the government. Look, there's no doubt that generally the public, when something like this happens, people can go on and on about their desire for small government, but when something like this happens, they look directly to the government to orchestrate the society-wide response to it. And so the long-term, largely Republican-led but tacitly supported by the centrist Democratic Party, defunding of these kind of organizations needs to stop. And I think, of course, when we get to not only questions of pandemics and disease control, but the climate emergency as well, we need to have these kind of science-grounded organizations be built up and strengthened much more than we've ever had them before. Because again, when you talk about the climate emergency, again, it will be the U.S. federal government that will orchestrate our necessarily society-wide response to the crisis.